All right. This is the American YAWP, Chapter 3, British North America. So, in this section, we're going to be solely focusing on the British colonies in North America. Last section, we talked about how other countries like the French and the Dutch and the Spanish, or last chapter, excuse me. So, we're focusing here on the British. And in earlier chapters, we also talked about some of the earliest colonies. So, for example, we mentioned Virginia. We mentioned Massachusetts. These were some of the first English colonies in the New World. In this chapter, we're going to talk about the rest of them. Eventually, we get to the point of the 13 original English colonies, although we probably won't talk about all 13 individually, but eventually we get to that area. So, in the introduction here, the English colonies of North America, or the British colonies of North America, are described as a colonial quote unquote backwater. And that is just reflective of kind of where the colony stood, especially the North American ones, in comparison to the rest of the British Empire, which is certainly growing in this period. So we might just say here about this quote unquote colonial backwater is that the we'll say the British NA for North American colonies were not very very big or very populated, profitable, etc., right, etc. Not that important, right? Not that important in terms of the overall, the overall British Empire across the world. So not so significant, even compared to, for example, the colonies of the Caribbean, which, even though they were in the New World, the Caribbean colonies were far more profitable than the colonies of North America. At the same time, though, even though the colonies might be an afterthought as far as the British Empire goes, they were connected to the rest of the world. There is an emerging Atlantic world, and sometimes this is described in, other, other textbooks as triangle trade, the triangular trade system. And what we mean by the Atlantic world is just the connection slash trade between the Americas, Europe, and Africa. And typically, the triangle trade refers to the three legs of this trade, one in the Americas, one in Europe, and one in Africa. So the colonies are connected not just economically, but please remember that whenever we talk about trade or the importance of trade, it's also things like ideas, culture. These things also get transplanted from one area to another. So, as far as the role that the Americas play in the overall Atlantic world, even those in North America, is that typically in this triangle trade, the Americas provide mostly the raw materials, and most of those raw materials are extracted using slave labor. So, we talked in the last section about how in the colony of Virginia, for example, that tobacco proved to be a very valuable cash crop for the English southern colonies. And in fact, tobacco saved the colony of Jamestown, which later on became Virginia, allowed it to be economically viable. But for the time period, it was the indentured servants that were providing the source of labor in those colonies. Indentured servitude, for reasons we'll talk about in this chapter here, is replaced by African chattel slavery. And this section, section 2, talks about that transition and specifically how the institution of slavery became solely dependent on race. So, one very important transition from servitude to African chattel slavery was a series of new laws or legislation that was passed that clearly made the distinction between black and white and free and slave. We might just say new laws passed in colonies which created a separate legal status for enslaved Africans. And this transition from servitude to chattel African slavery, again, there's no one single moment that it takes place, but we begin to see these new laws around the 1660s. And that is to say, the law recognizes white indentured servants as a separate category as those enslaved Africans, or even Africans who were indentured servants, right? The differentiation between black and white in the creation of race. Now, a kind of important point also to mention is that the English colonies did engage with, to a smaller degree, a limited degree as compared to the scale here, Native American slavery. And typically, Native American slavery was mostly a result of, we'll say, colonial Native American wars. And in these wars, POWs, or prisoners of war, were enslaved and sometimes sold. But for the same reasons why the Spanish, or not entirely all the same reasons, but for one of the main reasons why the Spanish abandoned their encomienda system, why they abandoned enslaving the Native American population, is also a similar thing that we see in the British colonies or the English colonies, and that was the high prevalence of disease, high disease rates. We might say discouraged Native American slavery. Africans from the old world, oops, my words and my thoughts mixed up, Native American slavery. So it did happen to a certain degree. Your textbook cites that anywhere between 24,000 to, what was it, 51,000 Native Americans were enslaved by the English colonies. But for the same reasons that other European nations in the New World that use slavery move away from Native Americans and prefer chattel African slavery, was the high rates of disease, right? The lack of immunities. Now, as far as how slavery was brought to the New World, please recall from an earlier section that one, it was sugar plantations, and two, the nations of Portugal and Spain were the first nations to bring chattel African slavery into the New World. But soon it would arrive on the shores of the English colonies as well. The voyage, or the forced transport of people from Africa into the New World and into the English colonies, is referred to as the Middle Passage. So this is a good key term to be familiar with. The Middle Passage can have kind of two meanings, but in its very kind of simplest form, this is the forced transport of Africans, the enslaved, to the New World. And depending on how you define the Middle Passage, it sometimes refers to all parts of this process, or sometimes it just refers to the middle part of this process, or the second part. So, typically, and again, this would have been just in terms of like statistically speaking, the most common way that a person in Africa found themselves enslaved was a result of war. So we might say the first leg, or the first part of the Middle Passage, was that POWs in Africa were brought to factories. And recall that the factory is a European trading post in Africa. So countries like Portugal, for example, had established trading posts in Western Africa going all the way back to the 1400s, nearly 200 years before Jamestown ever existed. And the factories provided the kind of baseline infrastructure for the way in which slavery would jump from Africa into the New World. So the first leg of this Middle Passage is in the factories, right? It's being captured POW, being brought to the coastline, and then being sold to a European merchant. The second leg is the boat ride itself. And sometimes when we use the term Middle Passage, sometimes we're only referring to the boat, but sometimes it's used for the whole thing. And the ship from Africa to the New World was very, very brutal. High rates of disease, starvation. It was very bad. I don't think our textbook mentions it, but I've seen in some places that the Middle Passage could have a 25% fatality rate. Simply just a quarter of all those who were enslaved simply died on the boat ride. And then once arriving into the New World, the third leg of the Middle Passage would take place, and that was the process of seasoning. And seasoning, for the most part, was the actual working on, the plantation or the mine or whatever it was. We'll call seasoning. This is the time to adjust to working in the New World. And depending on where one ended up, and in terms of just statistics, this was most commonly in places like the Caribbean. There would be seasoned. That was the term that they used, and that was kind of getting used to the work schedule, the labor, everything else that went into it. And as soon as a person was seasoned in the New World, then they could possibly be sold to another area. In our case, most likely to the colonies of North America, or the colonies of England. So 1, 2, 3. These are the three legs of the Middle Passage. Captured POW, brought to the factory, sold to a European merchant. The ship ride is the second leg from Africa to the New World. And then once getting in the New World, the process of kind of like breaking in enslaved individuals to the regiment of labor. In terms of statistically speaking, approximately 12 million went along the Middle Passage. Or, I've seen that number a little bit bigger in other areas, but go with what our textbook says. So that's quite a lot of individuals. And as far as, this Middle Passage goes, 2 million died. Now, the process of bringing enslaved Africans into the New World, this Middle Passage, was not just purely economic. And again, this harkens back to what we mentioned earlier, and that was when we think about commerce or trade or exchange, it's not simply the exchange of goods, but it's also the exchange of culture. And we certainly see the impact of the African slave trade in the Middle Passage in terms of the development of New World or American culture. One great example of this is the Gullah language. Gullah, this is a language brought to the New World from Africa. And I think even today, there's a small number of people who continue to use the Gullah language, but it's one example of how for all the brutality and dehumanization that the Middle Passage and African slave trade brought, and what was characterized by it, that still things like or cultural markers like the Gullah language do eventually make their way to the New World and survive even to this day. So the Gullah language, this is an African language spoken in the New World. We could see this image here. So let's just look at a couple of these images here. So this is Elmina Castle. This was initially a Portuguese factory. Looks like that this one was illustrated in 1666. And this would have been a trading post or a castle or structure fortification built on the African coast and provided the sort of gateway for enslaved Africans to be brought into the Atlantic world. If you look close enough at this image, you'll notice that this flag right here, that's not a Portuguese flag. That is, in fact, a Dutch flag, and that is representative of the fact that the Dutch had taken over a lot of Portugal's trade by the 1600s. So where it was earlier, the Portuguese and the Spanish brought the first enslaved Africans over, the Dutch and later on the British would be the major facilitators after that. Here we see a British slave ship, called the Brooks. And if you look close enough, you can see the way in which people were entirely crammed into these vessels. And when it came to the transport of enslaved individuals across the ocean, when it came to the Middle Passage, there were essentially two ways of doing it. One was what you see here. That's kind of the crammed in method. You simply try to cram in as many people as possible, knowing that the health conditions are not good, that a certain number of people are going to die, but hopefully that number for the enslavers, and I guess for the enslaved as well, is not that high. There were other slave ships that attempted to create better health conditions, a little bit more room, a little bit better rations, but those ships were not motivated by any type of, sort of moral superiority. They simply thought that just by allowing for a little bit more room, they would get more return on their investment. And so at the end of the day, whether a ship looked like this, looked like the Brooks, or had a little bit more humane conditions, it was all about the, all about the profit. Like we mentioned earlier, this is just reiterated in terms of facilitating the slave trade, the Portuguese in the 1500s, the Dutch in the 1600s, and eventually the British in the 1700s. And it's not to say that they're completely replaced, but that's generally speaking kind of how the development of the trade goes over the Atlantic Ocean. In terms of destination, most enslaved people arrived in the West Indies / Caribbean. So this was the destination. This was where mostly the seasoning would take place. And, if an enslaved person were to arrive to North America, to the English colonies, and later on the United States, not in all cases, but in many cases, they would have been enslaved in the Caribbean first and then sold up north to a colony in North America. These colonies were primarily producing sugar. These were sugar producers. And one reason why you don't find as much sugar in the British colonies of North America and later on the United States is because the climate isn't quite right. So when you go a little bit north, you end up getting commodities like rice, indigo, which is a purple dye, and tobacco once you get farther enough north. Now, in the British colonies, though, the gateway of slavery, essentially, was Charleston, South Carolina. We'll say capital. Actually, I don't know if it was the capital. I'm sure it was back then. I don't think it's the capital today. So we'll say Port City in South Carolina. Oops. And this had the highest population of enslaved Africans in British North America. So as far as the North American 13 colonies are concerned, Charleston is kind of number one in terms of the number of enslaved individuals. Surprisingly, and we talked about this last chapter, New York City was number two, at least during the colonial period, and that reflected a little bit of the Dutch footprint and, later on serving as sort of a trading post, at least as far as slavery is concerned in North America. Statistically speaking, inside of not just Charleston, enslaved Africans did arrive in other port cities. Again, this is just kind of the major gateway. In total, about 450,000 enslaved Africans were brought to British North America. That is about 4% of the total. Again, if we kind of, if we zoom out a little bit and look at the entire Atlantic world in terms of what destinations did enslaved Africans have, most of it is in the Caribbean, the West Indies, and we could also add Brazil here, a much smaller minority came to the North American colonies, but that's also reflective of the fact that the North American colonies were not as profitable. Now, what's interesting is not just the development of slavery economically, but also the role that it played politically, because especially in places like Charleston, South Carolina, we saw the relationship, or we can see the relationship between the system of slavery and geopolitics, namely the rivalry between Spain and England. So, just to set things up, we have essentially the English colonies of South Carolina and Georgia later on. Georgia is not founded until a little bit later. In fact, the reason why Georgia is founded is specifically for this. And then we have a borderland, and right below it, we have Spain, who controls Florida. So, because these colonies here in South Carolina and Georgia, especially South Carolina, were so dependent on slavery, and because the Spanish and the English were rivals, one thing that Spain did in an effort to undermine the English colonies was to offer a decree of sanctuary. This was a Spanish decree. And essentially, what it allowed for was, we'll say, which offered freedom to enslaved Africans from the English colonies. And in fact, kind of an interesting note is that the oldest free Black community in the United States was actually part of Spanish Florida and reflected Spain's sort of decree of sanctuary. So Spain, using the demographic composition, economic composition of the English colonies to try and undermine them by offering them a certain degree of freedom if they could escape, run to the Spanish colony of Florida or get to the Spanish colony of Florida, convert to Catholicism. Of course, there were some criteria for this decree of sanctuary. Convert to Catholicism, fight for the Spanish military. They could be offered their freedom in the New World, and a considerable or a certain number of people managed to achieve that. Now, as far as the English colonies of North America are concerned, there are some distinctions that we can draw between the North American colonies and the rest of the Atlantic world. And when we think about the rest of the Atlantic world, this is the Caribbean. This is the sugar colonies. So on the one hand, we can just look at something like the types of commodities. And we'd already mentioned this earlier, but we can maybe write this down. So in the English colonies, it was rice, indigo, which is a dye, and tobacco. In the Caribbeans, it was sugar, right? That was one. Along with the different commodities, though, also came differences in demographics. See, sugar was very, very labor intensive. In fact, it was about as labor intensive as a crop could get. And many of the colonies in the Caribbean, they weren't large settler colonies. They were entirely plantations. Now, that's true of some of the English colonies of the South, but as you get further and further north, there's a tendency to want enslaved individuals not just as field workers, but also as servants. So in English North America, you might have more servants. And so this affected demographics. So, for example, most of those who were enslaved in the Caribbean were young men. However, in English North America, there's men, there's women, children, et cetera, et cetera. So there tends to be a more balanced makeup of those who are enslaved, not simply just young men, but also others. Because of this reason, it meant that more enslaved children were born. And in terms of the way that slavery grows in the English colonies and later on the United States, it's mostly from the enslaved population reproducing. Whereas in the Caribbean or sugar colonies, this was the importation of enslaved people. So one of the reasons why only 4% of those that were brought to the New World ended up in the English colonies of North America was because, for the most part, the population of North America was self-producing, whereas, in the Caribbean it was not self-producing, and the labor conditions there were much more dire, right? Higher death rates here, a little bit lower death rates. So again, the system of chattel African slavery is the same in English North America and the Atlantic world, but the commodities, the demographics, the life expectancies, those things, there does tend to be some variation. Another commonality, though, is the development in which slavery and race was formed in the New World. And earlier, we talked about how the English colonies make this transition from a period of servitude to a period of slavery. And one of the key components in this transition is the development of new laws, which made a clear distinction between black and white and free and enslaved. And that only continues after the 1660s and becomes even more permanent. To bolster that is the emergence of this idea of race. Now, race, we're going to go ahead and simply just define it as, this is the way that your textbook defines it, the perceived physical, where is it? Perceived inherited physical differences and, in this case, in the New World, mostly skin color, that is used to support systems of oppression, in this case, slavery. So your textbook makes a great point and a great example here, saying that, when Africans and Native Americans, before the development of the New World, did not consider themselves as part of a same race. So when Native Americans went to war, or when Africans captured other Africans, POWs, and sold them off to Europeans, there was no consideration that these people belonged to the same group. Similarly, the English and Welsh, right, other Europeans, also did not identify as the same race. In other words, this idea of different racial categories in the New World only developed as a way to perpetuate the system of slavery that would emerge, and to invoke racial categories, to invoke racial superiority and racial inferiority, was a way to justify the institution of slavery and allow it to develop in the way that it did, eventually culminating in the American Civil War, at least in the American context, the United States context, culminating in the eventual American Civil War in the 1860s. Another good example for the ways in which this color line or distinctions based off race were made, again, we had mentioned earlier as far as the legal system goes. There's another great example here, a Virginia law in, we'll say Virginia law in 1643, which made the distinction between African women and English women or European women. And that was a law for, quote unquote, the tithable African woman. And what that means is that Virginia taxed, and that's what a tithe means. It's kind of like a tax. Virginia taxed African women as, field workers, essentially. So what the government was trying to figure out was, how many workers does a plantation or a plot of land have? And the more workers that you have, the more that you could tax them. And so what Virginia did was Virginia considered African women as part of these workers, whereas white women were not considered laborers. All right, so this is a clear example of how the law codes began to distinguish between white and black and making the system of freedom and enslavement equatable to that. Section 3, turmoil in Britain. So we just mentioned last section that the colonies and the British Empire, or just Great Britain in general, were connected. So anything that had gone on in Britain would have some sort of impact or effect in the colonies. And in this section, it goes over a little bit of how British politics would affect colonial policy. So we begin this section with Queen Elizabeth I. And Queen Elizabeth was one of the more successful English monarchs. We'll say her rule marked a golden era for England. If you want to map this onto something we talked about previously, this was when the Spanish Armada was defeated. This paved the way for British colonization of the New World, but also was a sign that, Spain, historically the most powerful empire due to their discovery of the New World, that maybe they were on the decline and England was on the ascendancy. Queen Elizabeth, though, also very much cemented Protestantism. It was originally King Henry VIII that broke away from the Catholic Church, and England was kind of divided, and you had a period of turmoil in which there, English Catholics were trying to fight back. Queen Elizabeth's long and very successful rule meant that England was going to stay a Protestant nation, which it more or less did. Now, the big kind of political event that is occurring in Britain during the period of colonization of the New World is the English Civil War, which lasts from 1640 to 1660. This is after the rule of Queen Elizabeth. And the important thing about the English Civil War that happens for 20 years is that this, in essence, puts a pause on British colonization of the New World. England is preoccupied with its own internal conflicts, and so it just means that there's not any colonization happening. And if we look at kind of the chronology of colonization in the New World, we have the earliest colonies like Virginia or Jamestown and Massachusetts. And then there is a civil war. And during the Civil War, there's really not a lot of colonization going on. After the Civil War, we have the founding of the rest of the English colonies, and we call these the Restoration colonies. So, in terms of chronological order, the earliest colonies of Virginia and New England pause for 20 years, and then the rest of the 13 colonies eventually get established. So, that's perhaps the most important political development going on back in Britain that does end up shaping the New World in a pretty significant way. Now, as far as the English Civil War itself is concerned, again, I would say it's not really super important for us in a class about American history, but to make a long story short, the monarch at the time, King Charles I, he represented the power of the monarchy, of course, he himself being the king, or wanted the monarchy to utilize or have the ability to use more power. He was also allied with a lot of the old Catholics. So Charles I represented English Catholics and Catholicism. And over in the colonies, it was the older colonies that had supported Charles I. Essentially, the English Civil War started, or part of the reason why it started was because the King Charles I was exercising power in a way that the British Parliament did not approve. And if you look at a lot of English history, just the hundreds or thousands of years of it, most of it is a fighting between the king or the monarch and the parliament. The parliament is a group of nobles. The parliament obviously represent the parliament. They were on the other side of this war. They represent Protestantism. The English Protestants got on their side. And some of the newer colonies supported parliament. So that's who the civil war is between, right? It's the king versus the parliament over power, over religion, and this maps on to the colonial world. As far as the outcome of the war goes, it was Charles I and the monarchs who lost. Charles I, King of England, executed by Parliament. So lost civil war. So Parliament wins, but what they do afterwards will send the British Empire into a period of 10 years or so of political chaos. And that is essentially the parliamentarians who won, they try to rule without a king, right? They don't want a monarch anymore. They're just going to run it as a protectorate. And the person who rules England for the next 11 years or so is Oliver Cromwell. And Cromwell was, we'll just call him from the forces of Parliament, rules England. Again, no. Say for the next 10 years. And ironically, Cromwell ends up ruling England much like a king himself, or at least like a dictator. And one of the things that Cromwell wanted to do during this period of the protectorate, again, England without a king, was to exercise more control over the colonies. And this was something that was not just unique to individual rulers like Cromwell and James, who we'll talk about here in a moment, but more broadly speaking, when more and more of these British colonies were established, the crown wants to exercise more control, more organization. They want the colonies to benefit themselves rather than exist for kind of their own separate reasons. So, one important law that is passed by Cromwell that will pop up in a future chapter are the Navigation Acts. And the Navigation Acts end up being one of the contributing factors to the American Revolution. But these were laws, we'll say laws that, we'll say forced colonial merchants to only trade with Britain. Right? Only trade with Britain. In other words, the colonies, if let's say you were a tobacco grower and you were selling your tobacco, there was a whole host of potential trading partners that one could have. You could sell it to the French, you could sell it to the Spanish, or you could sell it to the British. Well, the Navigation Acts were a series of laws that strictly forbid doing business with any other country, right? It forced the colonies to trade only with the British. And this was, under the idea of the time, the economic theory of mercantilism. This was the only acceptable relationship, or at least economic relationship, between the colonies and the mother country. Trading with other countries was seen as hurting the mother country and strengthening countries like French and Spain. You especially didn't want to buy things from those other countries. That's why the Navigation Acts also said that only English ships or British ships could come into port in the colonies. So again, in terms of this chapter here, it's just giving you a little bit of an example of how Cromwell and the Protectorate and just Britain in general was seeking more control over the colonies. We'll give a couple more examples. But we do want to keep the Navigation Acts in mind a little bit later down the road, because this insistence that the colonists can only trade with certain people, this is going to be one of the long-term causes of the American Revolution, because colonial merchants want to trade with whoever they want, right? And in fact, the Navigation Acts um, are one of the contributing factors to that. Now, when Oliver Cromwell died, this idea of ruling without a king, right, the fact that England would go with no king, and it caused enough chaos and problems that most agreed, even Parliament, that the king needs to come back. And so Parliament then proceeded to invite the son of the beheaded king, Charles II, uh, invite him back to become the king of England again. And so Charles II, we'll call him the son of the executed king, invited back to be the English monarch. And his invitation, and he accepted the invite. He came from France back to England, and he became the King of England. This is known as the Restoration, right? The restoration of the crown. So, once again, English Civil War, king is beheaded. Parliament tries to rule for a while without a king. That doesn't go very well. And so they invite the son of the executed king, the previous king, to come back to the throne. He does. And this is the restoration of monarchy. The colonies that are founded after this, because after the Charles II is restored, things sort of settle down, and now England can go back to focusing on the New World. We call the colonies after the restoration of the king the Restoration colonies, and those are the rest of the colonies until we eventually get to 13, right? 13 original colonies. Now Charles II, he when he's restored, he is someone who the relationship with Parliament begins to grow uneasy, but it's eventually his successor and the next king, James II, who really wants more control of the colonies, and B, his pro-Catholic, pro-France, say positions put him in opposition to Parliament. And to be quite honest, all these English rulers, Elizabeth, Charles I, Charles II, James, it's probably not super important, I would say, to just know them by name, but at the very least, just to understand how politics in Britain maps onto the colonies and how it shapes it. So James I wanted more control, and so there are two examples of this that we find under the rule of James II in the colonies. One of them is the Dominion of New England and its governor Edmund Andros. And the Dominion of New England is probably one of the better examples of how the British Parliament, or in this case, the king, excuse me, wanted to exercise more control. When the British looked across the Atlantic Ocean and saw the series of colonies that were beginning to take shape in the New World, they wanted to organize the colonies in a way that made it easier to govern. It didn't make sense for them to be, to have Massachusetts and Connecticut and Plymouth and Rhode Island and Virginia and all these separate colonies. And so instead, what happened under James II was that all these colonies were essentially combined together to form one political body called the Dominion of New England. So this was the combination of several New England colonies. What am I saying here? The combination of several New England colonies into one single governing body. So the Charter of Massachusetts was revoked. The Charter of New York was revoked. The Charter of New Jersey was revoked. And all those colonies who had some semblance of self-government up until this point were now all combined into one single blob. That blob was put under the rule of Edmund Andros. He is the governor of the Dominion. So, as you might imagine, if you are a Massachusetts colonist or New Jersey colonist or New York colonist, you don't like this, right? Because you're losing a certain degree of power or control. So, this was, we'll say, disliked by the colonists. It was seen as too much control. At the same time, there was another practice that was going on in the colonies that will also cause some pushback, right? Again, this is another control mechanism that Britain is trying to force onto the colonists. This one is impressment, and impressment is more or less the forced conscription, typically in the Navy, right? Not exclusively, of colonial men. Now, this is something that the British didn't only do to the colonists. It was something that they had in fact done to other people in Britain, but this was one of the ways in which which the British kept their what would we say, ranks populated in the military, mostly in the Navy, and that is essentially they would just kidnap people and force them to serve in the military, and this is something that the British are going to continue to do to the colonists, not just in this period, but through the American Revolution, even after the American Revolution. And, this practice of impressment ends up being a very, a spot of contention, right, between the British and colonies. Now, James II, who represents pro-Catholic, pro-France, pro-monarchy, and in some sense, pro-control over the colonies, his rule is not sitting well with the parliament. And in fact, there's kind of whispers and murmurs in parliament that perhaps England is headed for a second civil war. Here, James II versus parliament. Once again, James II is acting very much like the previous English king and exercising a lot of control. And his pro-Catholic stance doesn't sit well with a lot of parliamentarians. And so the thing that's different this time, though, is that James II kind of gets the message. And instead of declaring war on Parliament and reaching the same fate as his predecessor, Charles I, who was executed by Parliament, James simply just abandons the throne. And James running away and abandoning the throne is known as the Glorious Revolution. James II abandons throne. So all the building tensions between James and the Parliament and James and the colonies will go away. The Dutch Protestant, and this was very important, rulers, William and Mary, we'll say assumed the English throne. So James is out. William and Mary are in, and despite the fact I believe William was Dutch, Mary I believe was related to James in some way, shape, or form. But William and Mary were much more preferable because they would solidify Protestantism, and they were also coming over as monarchs as being invited to England, and so they didn't want to exercise the same type of power or control that James did. And the reason why we call this the Glorious Revolution was because there was no bloodshed, right? Whereas before, the English Civil War was bloody. This time we have a changing of the English monarch, but this time with no bloodshed, so therefore it was the Glorious Revolution. So what can we say about the consequences of the Glorious Revolution, and namely the impact on the colonies? Well, we have four things that we can outline. The first one is that it reasserted the power of Parliament over the monarchy. And this was just not back in England, but throughout the British Empire. And so when we start to get to the events that led to the American Revolution, most of the reforms and laws and control comes from Parliament. Parliament had reigned supreme. The second thing is that this is a clear affirmation of Protestantism. And, in the 13 colonies, Protestantism is more or less the official government of all 13 colonies. Previous colonies, we actually haven't discussed this yet, but, there were some colonies like Maryland, for example, that were founded for English Catholics. Any type of benefits or privileges that Catholics had, even in special places like Maryland, are eradicated because of this, right? England and the colonies themselves remain firmly committed to Protestantism. The Dominion of New England is dissolved. So, in some sense, self government was saved as a result. So, this effort by the king to just combine all the charters together into one political unit that didn't last. Massachusetts got its charter back. New York got its charter back. New Jersey got its charter back. Right, this giant blob under the rule of one single governor that was out. And instead, and this coincides with Parliament. Instead, it's the assemblies and self government that survive this thing. And the last thing is that, this wasn't necessarily just in the colonies, but throughout the British Empire was the creation of the English Bill of Rights. And the English Bill of Rights, in some sense, it limited or, kind of already cemented Parliament's position. It limited the power of the king, but also spoke to the rights of British subjects. And once again, later on down the road, when Parliament begins to exercise control over the colonies and start changing some of the laws, one of the things that the colonists are going to invoke, they're going to invoke their rights as British subjects. Section 4, the new colonies. So once again, I would say the takeaway from last section is that in terms of English colonization of the New World, you have the early colonies like Virginia and the New England colonies like Massachusetts. Then you have the second phase, which is the Civil War in England, 1640 to 1660. Not really a lot of colonization going on during this period. Then the third phase is the Restoration. And the Restoration colonies are the colonies that are established following the restoration of the monarch, Charles II. And that's the rest of the 13 colonies, essentially. So in this section, we'll just be kind of doing a brief overview of the colonies and kind of how they fit into, what's their motivation behind their founding, what sort of challenges did they face, and then what ultimately resulted. And we'll start with Maryland. So Maryland was initially created as a safe haven for English Catholics. And this was especially when the Protestants back in England were gaining the upper hand. And if you were an English Catholic and you were on the losing side, the question was, where could you go? The hope was that Maryland would be created for Catholics. And in fact, Catholics held some privileges in Maryland that they didn't hold in other parts of the British Empire. Maryland was also an earlier colony. I can't recall exactly what year that it was established, but it was established when Charles I, the beheaded monarch, was still ruler. However, though, eventually in Maryland, what happened was that many Protestants, say, moved to Maryland, essentially forcing colony to abandon its, we'll say, its privileges for Catholics. So it once was a safe haven for Catholics. At the end of the day, it becomes more or less like the neighboring colony of Virginia. It is a colony that grows tobacco and uses enslaved labor. In fact, we typically describe um, the colonies of Virginia plus Maryland, typically describe these as the Chesapeake colonies because they do end up looking entirely the same. Eventually, Maryland was placed or replaced as a royal colony. A royal colony is a colony, or I should say, yeah, a colony where the monarchy has, we'll say, more control slash power. So initially, Maryland's supposed to be a safe haven for Catholics. That eventually changed, and for the most part, Maryland became, like Virginia, a um, tobacco producing cash crop colony in the South. Now on to Connecticut. Connecticut was a colony that was created in New England, but this was created by an offshoot of Puritans that left Massachusetts to create their own colonies. So Connecticut is a Puritan. We'll call it a Puritan offshoot of the Massachusetts colony. And that's how a couple of these colonies formed this way. Massachusetts, which was ruled by the Puritans, they were very, very strict, and so anyone who had any problems with the Massachusetts colony, they might just go off and create a colony of their own. Connecticut was one of these colonies. Another one was the New Haven colony, which was essentially the same thing. This was um, another Puritan offshoot. Oops. Another Puritan offshoot. However, this one eventually failed and joined or signed with Connecticut. So eventually, New Haven, which was technically a separate colony, eventually combined. And this is actually what happened with Plymouth, for example. Plymouth, which was established by the Pilgrims as their own separate colony, was eventually combined with. These are, and even if you look at New England today, there's a lot of small, tiny little states kind of in that region. And that's reflective of the fact that a lot of those colonies were created as the sort of internal religious differences between Massachusetts and some of their inhabitants. The better example is the case of Rhode Island, and Rhode Island is probably the best example of the religious intolerance of the Puritan Church and the desire to create something that was a little bit more open in terms of social and political control. Rhode Island, we'll say this is a New England colony. Created by Puritan exiles. That's probably the best way of putting it. So these were people who got kicked out of the Puritan colony of Massachusetts, decided they would go and create their own. Roger Williams, he is the founder of Rhode Island. He had been banished by Massachusetts. Probably the most famous exile from the Puritans, Anne Hutchinson, also moved to Massachusetts. After her exile. From Massachusetts. And more broadly speaking, anyone that thought that the religious laws were just too strict, whether it was from Connecticut or New Haven or Plymouth or Massachusetts or whatever New England colony you can pick from, Rhode Island became a popular destination. They had a certain degree of religious and political freedom. This attracted settlers. They also abolished, this was a way to make the um, settlement more attractive too to outsiders, witchcraft trials. The Salem witch trials had occurred in Massachusetts in the 1690s. Imprisonment for debt, and also slavery. So the abolition of these things made it a bit more attractive than other areas. And so when we think about Rhode Island, we typically think about it as a colony of religious toleration. But remember, when we're talking about religious toleration in the 1600s, we're mostly talking about for Protestants. Other religious denominations like Catholics or Jews, um, maybe not the same type of toleration as other Protestants would get. Yet, there's plenty of religious intolerance to go around within just Protestant circles. The next colony we'll touch upon is New York, and New York, I would say probably the important thing about the New York colony. This colony was formerly New Netherland. Right, this was initially where the Dutch had set up. But remember, for the Dutch, their New World colonies never really were that prosperous or that populated. Um, and when the Dutch and the British went to war, the Dutch were pretty willing to part with their colonies. They didn't really see them as extra important. This colony was formerly New Netherland. It was won by the British in a series of wars. So New Netherland becomes New York. The capital city of New Amsterdam becomes New York City. And New York was what they called a proprietary colony. This is different than a royal colony. And a proprietary colony is a colony that is the property of an individual. And the person who owned New York, essentially owned it like it was his own, country, essentially, was the Duke of York, who also happened to be James II before he was king, right? So the Duke of York got to own New York like it was his own property and could make whatever rules or laws or policies that he wanted. Now, one of the problems with proprietary colonies, and to a lesser extent, this is also true of royal colonies. Remember, royal colonies is where the monarch has a lot more control. Is that they tend to be not as popular, because especially in proprietary colonies, the Duke of York can, pretty much rules it like a king. People are a little bit hesitant to move to those types of colonies that have a lot of oversight and control. Um, Other colonies that we'll just mention, East and West Jersey, these were eventually combined into New Jersey. So we do see, in some sense, a consolidation of the colonies. They'll eventually get to 13 of them. Not that we're going to talk about all 13, but this is just kind of a good start to touch upon some of them. I would say of all the restoration colonies, of all the colonies that were established after the English Civil War, probably the most important one is Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania is important because at the end of the day, it's the Pennsylvania colony that becomes the most popular colony in the most, not just popular, also say success of the 13 colonies. colonies. And the reason why, or one of the reasons why, was because Pennsylvania was created in an effort to try to build a somewhat harmonious society. See, the founders of Pennsylvania subscribed to a religious belief system called the Society of Friends, or better known as Quaker. So these were founders of Pennsylvania and created colony really based on harmony. It attracted a diverse group of people. Part of what made Pennsylvania successful also was that it was kind of a middle colony. So it wasn't too cold in the winter, it wasn't too hot in the summer. And so because it had kind of a middle sort of temperature, it's really good for farming. So if you're wanting to move there and kind of live a little bit more comfortably, Pennsylvania was more attractive. The founder of Pennsylvania was William Penn. There. And he was a Quaker himself, and we'll talk about how the Quaker belief system ends up influencing the formation of. But he said, quote, "The people are a collection of diverse nations in Europe, as French, Dutch, German, Swedes, Danes, Finns, Scotch, and English, and all of the least equal to all of the rest." So this emphasis on building really a diverse group of settlers in Pennsylvania and trying to create a colony based off of harmony, which is what they did in Pennsylvania or tried to do. The Quakers, kind of what influenced this is that, they had a belief in sort of a spiritual equality. And that translated into politics. So, because the Quakers believed in kind of this equality of souls, so to speak, they also kind of mapped that onto their colony, and that's what made it a little bit more harmonious and a little bit more popular. But maybe most unique about the Quaker belief system was their belief in pacifism, and pacifism is a refusal to use violence. And a refusal to use violence made Quakers at the very least very uncomfortable with slavery. Now, it wouldn't be a discomfort level that would lead to the abolition of slavery in Pennsylvania. Slavery would be legal there. Um, but at the very least, by the time of the American Revolution, the Quakers would make the owning of enslaved individuals reason enough to get kicked out of the church. The pacifism also, we might say, made diplomatic relations with Native Americans. So, whereas all other colonies fought with Native Americans, Pennsylvania, to a lesser degree, their pacifist belief really kind of influenced this notion that we should make peace with the natives. And probably, if you were to measure Pennsylvania next to all the 13 colonies, you could probably say that Pennsylvania had the best relationship. Some of the earliest anti slavery writings come out of Pennsylvania. So, this belief in pacifism not only makes Pennsylvania kind of uneasy with slavery, but also makes them a lot more diplomatic with their neighbors. And because there was less prevalence of warfare there in Pennsylvania, that also was a reason to back to the colony. Even though the Quakers were the founders of the Pennsylvania colony, you had a lot of other outside immigrants that came in, and they didn't always live by the ideals of the Quaker religion. But certainly by the time of the American Revolution, the nation's leaders are meeting in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Philadelphia, and Philadelphia served as almost like a capital as far as the 13 colonies go. So that kind of shows you a little bit about how popular and successful the Pennsylvania colony eventually came. The last colony that is mentioned in this section is the Carolina colony. And like many of the colonies that were created after the Restoration, the Carolina colony was more or less a favor to the loyal supporters of the restored king, Charles II. So we might say Carolina was given to loyal followers of Charles II. And that's how some of these restoration colonies are established. So the Lord's Proprietor, this was the group. This was eight men who would create the colony. Also wanted to limit Spanish power in Florida. And we can see this in some of the other colonies, although we didn't mention it. So Carolina, given to 8 people who were loyal to Charles II. William Penn, he actually ended up with this colony because Charles owed William Penn's dad some money. So rather than pay William Penn back, he just gave him a colony, called it even. And in the case of New York, right, the Duke of York, or James II, was Charles's brother, right? So, being a good brother, he simply just gave his brother a colony to have for himself. So, not all, but many of these restoration colonies have some sort of connection with the restored monarch. However, though, in the Carolina colony, despite the effort by these 8 followers of Charles II to create and plan out kind of this perfectly organized colony, the Carolina colony ends up taking shape much like the rest of the southern colonies and the colonies in the Caribbean, and that is a colony that uses enslaved labor in order to produce cash crops for the empire. The difference here in Carolina, though, is that the type of commodities that are produced is different, and that is rice and indigo. And this is produced in we call them the Low Country. I don't want to put that part in. The Low Country, which is Carolina, Georgia, while the Chesapeake we'll say produces tobacco. Both use slavery, right? Both use slavery. The only difference between Carolina and the Low Country is the commodity that is produced, typically rice in Carolina and Georgia, tobacco in Virginia and Maryland. However, though, eventually the Carolina colony had to split between North and South. See, Carolina was initially one colony, had to split into North and South Carolina, which exist today as 2 different states. North Carolina tended to grow more tobacco. South Carolina tended to grow more rice. So there is somewhat of a distinction. North Carolina kind of becomes a little bit more like Virginia. And the reason why it happened was because if we look at a map here, this essentially was the border for the Carolina colony. And Carolina ended up getting 2 kind of like population centers. The first one was from the people who left the Caribbean islands, places like Barbados and Jamaica. Initially, those colonies had indentured servants who were doing most of the labor there. But as slaves began to replace servants in the Caribbean, they moved up north to the very southern tip. Meanwhile, in Virginia, as those indentured servants became free and as those servants got replaced by enslaved Africans, they moved to the very north part of Carolina. So you essentially had 2 groups of people at 2 polar ends of the colony. And so they decided, look, we can't govern it as one single colony. Let's just split it down the middle, call one north, call one south, and that's where North and South Carolina came from. All right, last section, section 5, Riot, Rebellion, and Revolt. And for all the differences between the 13 colonies, one similarity that we can trace really throughout from north to south is that in some way, shape, or form, there is some violent confrontation going on, and this in part helps shape the development of colonies. So we'll begin first with the New England colonies and the Pequot War. This is a war between the English colonies and allies versus the Pequot tribe and their allies. Now, the cause of this war was in part due to some of the tribal rivalries that had already existed up until that point, but namely over resources. Furs, remember the fur trade, and wampum. Wampum was a type of currency that was used by Native Americans. It was essentially money. So we're going to say that competition over resources led to the conflict, or at least was a contributing factor. During the Pequot War, one particular instance of brutality was the Mystic Massacre. The Mystic Massacre was when the English and allies killed anywhere between 400 to 700 Pequot men, women, and children. The destruction of the Pequot in this war would be so significant that future generations of people would talk about kind of the ways in which the Pequot were nearly wiped out. And the nature of the conflict, the Mystic Massacre we see here, men, women, and children all being fair game, very much reflected that these were settler communities that were going to war. They weren't necessarily only professional armies fighting on the battlefield, but in many of these raids and these attacks and counterattacks, men, women, and children were killed during these conflicts. So the Pequot War was a victory for England and their allies, and only kind of increased England's influence and power in the region. But it wouldn't be the last major conflict. In fact, the last major conflict, as far as the New England colonies go, is King Philip's War. This was a larger conflict between English colonists and Native Americans in New England. And to make a long story short, your textbook does go into more detail about the event by event situation. It was more or less an escalation. So you still have the kind of competition over resources in the background, um, but it was an escalation of for the most part revenge killings. One person was killed that caused a revenge killing of three people being killed. That caused a revenge killing of nine people being killed, and this escalation of violence eventually led to an outbreak of war. Those who were leading the side of the Native Americans, in this case, it was the Wampanoag tribe, was the sachem. Remember, sachem is a leader. It is a title of a chosen or elected leader in Native American tribes. Metacom, who was the leader of the Wampanoag against the English colonists. And he was called King Philip by the English. King Philip was King of Spain. Now, Metacom wasn't literally the Spanish king, but since the English and the Spanish hated each other, to call Metacom King Philip was somewhat of a derogatory term, right? The English may as well be fighting against the Spanish. And in this war, we can see another characteristic of colonial Native American warfare. It's not just the fact that settler communities were going to conflict, but it was the complicated manner in which alliances were built. Now, at the beginning of King Philip's War, it was the colonies of Plymouth, Connecticut, and Massachusetts that declared war on the Wampanoag. And we had mentioned earlier that, in this war, that fighting on one side were the English and their allies and the Pequot and their allies. And in fact, one of the allies of the Pequot were the Dutch. So the Dutch sided with the Pequot in this conflict. And one of the allies for the English in this conflict was the tribe of the Mohegans. So, you could have these conflicts in which Native Americans would side with the colonists, and even other outside European powers might side with Native Americans. In the case of King Philip's War, the other tribes around the region, by this time the Dutch were kicked out, essentially, included tribes like the Narragansett, the Mohegans, and the Pequot. And groups like the Mohegans and the Pequot would eventually end up siding with the English in this one, whereas the Narragansett, who tried to remain neutral, however, when the English attacked the Narragansett, um, kind of accidentally, not really by accident, but when they attacked them, they ended up deciding to side with the Wampanoag, and this revealed, kind of a truth about colonial conflicts, especially as it pertained to the quote unquote middle ground. The middle ground is kind of the contested territories between European powers and Native American sides. Is that natives sometimes allied, fought, or declared neutrality in self-interest. Right? In self-interest. In fact, there could even be conflicts in which certain groups, start off a conflict being neutral or on one side and then end up switching to the other side. It all depends on what benefits them, in their own self-interest. This was another conflict in which the English won, but this war was far more destructive. 1,000 English were killed, about 3,000 Native Americans. And not only did it contribute to the heightened hatred between both sides, which certainly was, but also contributed to colonial paranoia. And this paranoia fits in perfectly with a series of trials that took place in Massachusetts in the late 1690s that often don't get discussed as part of the overall kind of, the overall picture of the New England colonies at the time. And that is the New England colonies are just emerging from this very brutal, deadly conflict. We have to recall that from the perspective of the English, that they view Native Americans as not being Christian, as being agents of Satan. And because they successfully attacked about half of all the English settlements on the New England coast, there's this strong sense of fear. So this fear resonates in certain towns, specifically in Salem, Massachusetts, where the people of Salem end up going crazy and accusing each other of witchcraft. The Salem witch trials, these were held in 1692, and we'll say the townspeople accused each other of witchcraft, leading to 14 executions. And what gave these accusations more credence was the paranoia that had been built in the decades earlier and, the constant warfare and threat that Native Americans posed. Moving now to the conflicts in the southern colonies. And here we're going to go to Virginia. And the main conflict in Virginia, and probably the most important one in this section, is Bacon's Rebellion. This is conflict in the colony of Virginia. And the origins of the conflict is much like the earlier conflicts that we mentioned with the Pequot War and King Philip's War. It's namely the violence that breaks out between Native Americans and the local Virginian population. Here, it's somewhat of a similar story in terms of a natural escalation of violence. Bacon's Rebellion starts off as, once again, a sort of series of revenge killings in some ways and an escalation of that. But one other factor that will contribute here that is aiding Native American and Virginian violence is that servants, after their contract, move to the frontier in hopes of acquiring land. That places them in conflict with natives. So this is less about trade. It has a little bit to do with trade, but it's less about furs, less about wampum, and more due to the fact of indentured servitude. And essentially, Bacon's rebellion is not simply just a conflict between Native Americans and Virginians, it's between Native Americans and the two separate classes in Virginia. Because on the one hand, in Virginia, we have the landowners, right? They own the land. They're the wealthy, they're the rich. They have the House of Burgesses. They're represented by Sir William Berkeley. He is the governor of the colony, and he represents the landowners. Now, the landowners, they have no business or no interest on the frontier because thanks to reforms like the headright system, they have all the land in the middle of the colony that they need. They were there first. But then we have our indentured servants. And initially, early on, these indentured servants would die at a pretty young age. Not very many would survive their contract because of the poor health conditions. But as time goes on, these indentured servants are they're living out their contract. And so they agree to work for 7 years, they agree to work for 9 years, whatever it is. They're becoming free, they want their own land. And by moving out west to try and acquire those lands, they're getting into conflict with Native Americans. And so the third category is Native Americans. And so initially, Bacon's rebellion starts off as a conflict between the servants and Native Americans, primarily over land. However, though, the servants demand on the landowners to declare war. The servants say to the House of Burgesses, they say to William Berkeley, please declare war on the natives because we servants, we want our land. The landowners in the House of Burgesses essentially say no. That is, they don't want war. The landowners with Native Americans. The servants want war because they want that land. And so it's the refusal of Sir William Berkeley to declare war on Native Americans that actually causes the rebellion. Nathaniel Bacon, he is leader of the servants. And upon this refusal by William Berkeley and the landowners, he leads an army on Jamestown and destroys the city. So essentially, when we think about Bacon's rebellion, this is a rebellion between, we'll say between the landowners slash Eastern urban versus the servants, who are the Western rural population. That is the two sides that are fighting. Sir William Berkeley is eventually forced to flee. Nathaniel Bacon then, after declaring war, right, essentially the servants declare war on the landowners. After successfully burning down the city and forcing William Berkeley to flee, the servants then go out and try to declare war on the Native Americans, but that ends up failing. The rebellion kind of sputters out, and eventually it fails. Nathaniel Bacon himself dies during the rebellion, and British redcoats or British professional soldiers come back and not come back, but they arrive and they put William Berkeley back in power. So you might say eventually the servants are defeated. Berkeley put back in power. Those that were part of the rebellion that were captured afterwards were executed by Berkeley and its government. So, what is the significance of this rebellion, right? Why is this such a big deal? Well, one of the consequences, or one observation that we might be able to point out here, is that this, in some ways, is the first English versus English conflict. Now, it does originate over the tension building up between the colonists and Native Americans, but when we think about the rebellion, it is fundamentally the servants, the poor class, the rural class of Virginia, rising up and destroying the homes and kicking out the landowners. And in some ways, this is foreshadowing the American Revolution, because the American Revolution essentially is an English on English conflict. It's English people killing other English people in the American Revolution. Um, the servants do get defeated, but there is a very important thing, and that is the landowners. This is not the only reason, but this is one of the reasons. Fearing the servants favor chattel, chattel, African slavery. See, the problem for landowners of indentured servants is twofold. One is that indentured servitude is not a system based entirely off of race. And so to make dividing lines between white and black and introduce race into the category makes it easier to control. But another problem for indentured servitude is that indentured servants eventually become free. Chattel African slaves don't. And because the servants were able to become free, that's what caused some of these problems. So, this fearing of servitude and preferring African slavery, we would say that Bacon's Rebellion is one of those political events, not the only event, but it's one of those events that marks this transition of servitude to slavery. And if you're a landowner, if you're William Berkeley, if you're trying to control labor and make more money off it, do you want laborers that will become free in 7 years? And after they become free in 7 years, they're going to have a lot of, anger and resentment built up, and they might come back to the city and destroy your land. Or do you want labor that is permanently enslaved, so they'll never become free and they can never cause problems? We typically cite Bacon's Rebellion as being one of those events that marked this transition from a period of servitude into the development of slavery. There are a few other conflicts that we'll talk about in this section. One of them does not have anything to do with the English colonies, but rather has to do with the Spanish colonies, and that is the Pueblo Revolt. The Pueblo Revolt is the revolt of the Pueblo people against Spanish authority in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And the source of this, and we might be able to draw a little bit of a distinction here, and this is maybe worth noting, is that you'll notice that earlier English conflicts, these were wars and massacres. The Spanish conflict is revolt. And that is very much reflective of the two different styles or two different approaches when it came to colonization. That for the most part, the English sought to segregate themselves from Native American populations. They did not incorporate Native Americans into the English colonies. They built alliances, sure, but they didn't incorporate them. The Spanish sought to incorporate. Again, a revolt sort of infers that it's coming from within, and that's exactly what happened, because the reason why the Pueblo Revolt took place and why the Pueblo Native Americans decided to revolt against Spanish authority was because the type of conversion tactics the Spanish were using were far too harsh. Pope, he was the leader. Looks like Pope, but it's Pope, leader of the Pueblo Revolt. We might say kicked out Spanish for harsh conversions. This also kind of gives us an example of how Spanish conversion tactics differed from French conversion tactics. French were a lot more peaceful, I guess one might say, and religious crimes. This was part of what inspired things like the Black Legend, stories of awful Spanish treatment in the Americas. So, kind of sick and tired of the harsh punishments. Oftentimes it could involve whippings or beatings out in public if you committed some sort of religious crime. The missionaries in Santa Fe were very, very, very strict as a result of that. And the Pueblo simply rose up and eventually kicked this out. 400 Spaniards killed. Things like crosses, cows were destroyed. You might be asking yourself, okay, the cross makes sense because that has to do with Christianity. Why were the cows killed? Well, remember, cows and livestock, those were from the old world. Cows and horses and other domesticated animals didn't exist. And so anything that was symbolic of the Spanish presence in New Mexico was destroyed, including some of the livestock. Now, the Pueblo Revolt succeeded, but only succeeded for a short period of time. Eventually, the Spanish would arise. But it is good evidence, or at least the Pueblo Revolt does give us a little bit of an insight into how the colonization tactics of the English and the Spanish might differ from one another, and an instance in which Native Americans, albeit temporarily, were successful in resisting outside European influence. And so for that reason, people like Pope being leader of the revolt are celebrated today. One more conflict that we'll talk about, the Yamasee War. The Yamasee War, this was a war between Yamasee and South Carolina. And the significance of this conflict was that up until that point, we had mentioned this earlier in the chapters, that you had a certain level of Native American slavery or the enslavement of Native Americans. This war between the Yamasee and South Carolina, we might say, disrupted the Native American slave trade. We might say, not really forcing, but maybe influencing the growth of African slavery. So the same still holds true in terms of the preference for African slaves over Native American slaves due to the resistance of diseases. But there had been a slave trade going on in South Carolina and the West for the enslavement of Native Americans, but this war disrupted that and further pushed, if we want to think about a political factor, further pushed the colonies in South Carolina here to grow more towards African slavery. Now, one thing that we mentioned was that conflict between colonists and Native Americans was a commonality that you found all across the 13 colonies. But, if we did have to say that there was one colony that was peaceful, it was Pennsylvania, because the Quakers believed in pacifism. That really limited the warfare. And so there's no specific incident to talk about in the case of Pennsylvania. With that being said, there were still other colonists that moved to Pennsylvania that weren't Quakers. So, for example, Scottish and Irish people would move to Pennsylvania, and sometimes there'd be some sort of war breakout for that reason. But there is sort of an interesting, I guess, interaction or diplomatic incident that is mentioned here in the case of Pennsylvania that goes to show you that the relationship between Native Americans and the colonists, despite the fact that the colonists, or here the Quakers, might not believe in violence or use violence or resort to violence, that it wasn't always maybe equal or friendly. And that is the Walking Purchase of 1737. And so this was an agreement between the Delaware and Pennsylvania to give Pennsylvania all land that one could walk in a day and a half. And that was to create enough buffer between the Delaware and the people of Pennsylvania so that they could avoid each other and perhaps avoid violence. Naturally, those in Pennsylvania, instead of using this phrase, or instead of kind of resorting to this amount of territory that could be walked in a day and a half, I mean, for Native Americans, this would have referred to a specific distance, right? Sort of a day and a half away, so to speak. The colonists of Pennsylvania took that literally and hired, the fastest runners that they could find and timed how far they could run in a day and a half, and then claimed that land for themselves. So even though we might say that the Walking Purchase was not necessarily a war, it did, it does reveal the maybe combative relationship or combative nature, or combative at the worst, exploitive at the worst, maybe misunderstanding or misinterpretation at the least, even between colonies that were peaceful and the native inhabitants of that region.